Hi everyone, I'm Jesse Lynn.
And I'm Angela Lynn. Welcome back to another episode of But Where Are You Really From?
This week, we wanted to talk about the concept of parental love and how our own feelings, perspectives, and expectations have changed as it relates to this kind of through the years as we've evolved ourselves and as we've evolved our relationship with our parents. I think that growing up as a first generation Asian American, you're always kind of seeking this form of love or expression of love that your parents just don't really know how to give you. And for me, it wasn't even like this intrinsic thing necessarily. It was just seeing how easy it was to communicate love from other people, like in my class or other students, between themselves and their parents. And that was kind of what I was looking for, right? It was like this sense of and desire of ease in terms of affirmation from my parents. So we really want to dive into that because I think you guys may have heard some of our other episodes, but really how we felt about our feelings for our parents has really changed. And I think our perspectives have really widened to be more encompassing of their experience and what their lives have been like being here in the US and having to raise us here in a foreign country.
The obvious place to start is where, like, kind of the evolution of how our expectations versus reality on expressions of love. And of course, growing up as American born kids, you're always seeking affirmation, as you mentioned, and you don't want to be weird, right? Like, whatever you think is normal is what you want to be. You don't want to stand out when you're a kid. You just want to feel acceptance. So when you see what is quote unquote normal from your friends and classmates and whatever, is like their parents very easily say things like, love you, bye. Like it's just it's almost a throwaway word because it's so easy for them to say, love you. And they hug them, they kiss them on the cheek, write them little notes in their lunchbox, like whatever it may be. There were always all these like little forms of very outward expressions and explicit expressions of love. And I also felt really jealous of when I saw friends who were like kind of friends with their parents. I don't know if you ever saw that, but I had like one or two
Yes.
friends where yeah, they were so close with their parents. Like, I'd go over to their house and their mom would be like, hey, I'm like so happy you're back. You want to bake cookies together? Like, it was just like, oh, I like spending time with you. Like, let's spend time together. And I was like, what's this like? And it was just like, why don't I have that? Kind of where it started for me.
There was just a feeling of difficulty of understanding who my parents were. And so for the longest time, I just couldn't appreciate who they were as people because I couldn't communicate in that way with them, right? And I didn't really come to this realization until maybe 10 years ago. 10 years ago sounds like a long time ago, but also like 10 years ago, I was like 21. So I was already basically an adult. But there's this idea that your family imprints on you, which is as an Asian person, it's like your family is always your family. Like it doesn't matter what happens. And I feel like I really did take that into myself as a truth. But then when I turned like 21, I was like, who are my parents? I was like, who are they? Like I got curious. I was like, who are they as people? Like, what was it like for them growing up? What was it like for them immigrating here? Like, these are all kind of like things that I just never thought to like start the conversation about because I just wasn't curious about them in that way because I was just like, oh, this is mom and this is dad. And so that's like all the depth there is to them as people. But it wasn't until I really thought about them outside of this like mom, dad box where I was like, maybe the reason that we don't have as great of a relationship as I want is that I've never been curious about them in that way outside of kind of this role that I have them like in.
You hit the nail on the head that the main change, I think, from going from adolescence to adulthood is that there's, hopefully, for most people, a realization that you're not the center of the universe. Like, when you're young, it's all about you. Like, as you're not self-aware enough to understand that you're constantly only looking at things from like your perspective, how it impacts you, what happens to you, what people are doing to you. Like it's always centered on you being the protagonist. And like, not to say you shouldn't be the protagonist of your own life, you should be, but you shouldn't be the only character that matters in the story, right? And so when we're young, I never thought about my parents outside of the roles of like, you're my mom, you're my dad, like you're supposed to take care of me, you're supposed to love me, you're supposed to do all these things for me. Not like, oh, you're like your full own person. Yeah. And like, as much as I think so, like I think of myself and my life as having this fully fledged story of its own, you have a similar thing in your life because you are the protagonist of your life. So where do I fit into that? And if I'm desiring things like outward expressions of love from you, is that even a possibility given the whole context of the way you were brought up and you understand love and the relationship between a mother and child? I definitely remember having clashes with them when I was growing up, not as a kid. I think when you're like 11 and under child, it's hard to even really wrap your head around like what exactly you want or need and to verbalize that. So I knew I felt like dissatisfied with not having these things like hugging and whatever external quote unquote normal forms of love, but I couldn't pinpoint that. I was just like, oh, I don't know, my mom's weird, she doesn't like do those things. But then when I got into, I'd say like teenage years is when I started kind of pinpointing like the differences and what was bothering me more. And I do remember kind of having like a blow up at my mom when I was somewhere between like 13 and 15. And I was like, why don't you ever tell me that you love me? And like, your mom is more affectionate, I'd say, than my mom. But I was like, you've literally never given me a hug. Like, I'm sure she did when I was, 4 and under, because you're always being held as a child back then. But like from my, real memories of operating as a person, I was like, I literally can't remember the last time you hugged me or ever in my life. And I had these kind of like, I had a breakdown because I was just like, I need these things and why don't you give me these things? And she was like very confused and she got kind of angry too about kind of being accused of something that she couldn't really understand why I was getting upset about, if that makes sense. Because I think one of the first things she said, and it's a repeated line she says a lot to me when we have these kind of cultural clashes, because ultimately I feel like it comes down to a cultural clash between being raised in the East versus being raised in the West, and certainly generational as well, because I'm sure in Asia now people probably show more affection than maybe our parents when they were growing up. But she was like, I wasn't raised that way. Like, what do you expect from me? Like, she literally said that to me when I was a teenager, and I didn't take it for anything when she said it back then. But when she says that kind of stuff now when I'm an adult, I'm like, okay, that actually makes a lot of sense. It doesn't make me feel less, like, hurt about things, but it gives important context to things. Like, we've talked about this slightly in the past, right? But you can't be what you can't see. So, like, literally, I don't know if she ever got a hug from her parents. And, like, certainly they don't explicitly just say, like, I love you. So it was more like me reflecting back now as an adult on those kinds of clashes and interactions. I can appreciate it more of, like, yeah, that would be really difficult to expect that from you if you yourself had never received that kind of expression.
Hey listeners, wondering how you can support us? The biggest way is by increasing our visibility by following us on Instagram at Where Are You From Pod, on TikTok at But Where Are You Really From, subscribing to our YouTube channel under But Where Are You Really From Podcast, rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, and telling your friends. The more people we can get to listen to the show, the more we can continue spotlighting different perspectives and stories. And if you feel so inclined, we're also accepting donations at buymeacoffee.com/whereareyouFrom. Thanks y'all.
When I look back, the idea is not to like forgive certain moments which were very difficult, because there are a lot of moments where I was like, yes, they grew up in a different time and place, but like the way that something happened is really fucked up, and I'm not erasing that. Like, it is super fucked up. But I think it's more like being able to forgive those things and recognize love where it's expressed, but maybe not in the way that you were expecting. So maybe we could talk about some of those things. I mean, we talk about all the time, the whole like fruit cutting, preparing you meals, like making sure you're fed. Like, those are all, I think, very important expressions of love. I think maybe we also had like a different lunch experience, but I really liked it when my mom made me food, because I would come to school with like udon noodles and people would be like, that's a bomb ass like lunch meal. that was one of the things where I was like, yes, I really like this. Yeah.
Acts of service is definitely, I would say, the default Asian way of showing love. Of course, the surface level things, like you already said, like the cut fruit and whatever, is what everyone goes back to. But I really do think because our parents were immigrants themselves, the unspoken one is obviously like the major sacrifice of having moved their lives to the US and starting a new life there and providing for us. I think a lot of my clashes with my parents around these types of topics, and also a lot of different things like my career path and searching for self-fulfillment and stuff, always comes down to, frankly, there's a big difference between their lives and transitioning to the US of just survival mode, and like the amount of effort and energy it took to just provide and make sure that we were safe and like in a good enough place that we weren't lacking of anything, right? Like neither of us grew up rich, but it's not like we're poor or like couldn't make ends meet or anything like that. So just the sheer amount of effort and resolve it took for them to make that happen for us was their like major act of love. But for us, because we did start at a base where like we're fine, like survival is not a like thing that's even top of mind for us. It's like given that we're gonna survive. So now that we have the luxury of thinking about things like, what kind of meaning do I want in my life? Like, what perfect partner do I want to like complement me in a relationship? And all these things that we only have the luxury of spending emotional thinking around because we never have to think about survival as a foundational thing. So we're just like in a different sphere of like nags at our lives because we don't have to care about the survival part. So I really do think their sacrifice was like their major act of love. So then anything beyond that is kind of like, what else do you want from me, kid? Like I gave you everything. It's like, I think a lot of the way that they see things.
What you just pointed out, I think, is also a huge factor in how confusing it might have been to try to like determine whether it's love or not that's coming from your parents, right? Because they never had that luxury of like having the intention to choose something, right? Because it's kind of like their life paths were pretty narrow in terms of the decisions that they could make. So for me, I always kind of felt a little bit like, do you love me, or is this just like your obligation? You know, that whole idea of like, you're my child, and like, what kind of person would I be if I didn't take care of you? But that's a very different thing from like caring about someone deeply. Like there's an obligation, and then there's like whether or not you truly feel for that person. And like, it's a little bit harder to determine that when you don't hear it directly from the person, right? So you're kind of just like reading the tea leaves, so to speak, like trying to suss out if certain actions are indicative of love. And I think that's where a lot of this like parental love insecurity comes from, at least for me, which is like, do you guys really love me, or is just like you feel obligated to raise me because that's just like the overall expectation that you kind of grew up in?
Yeah, this is one of those things that we just talked about, kind of language, and if you can fully express a culture through language. And this is one of those things where I'm having a little bit of trouble verbalizing, is that I think what you just described is very complicated and it's very Asian, or like it's very Chinese, but it's also Asian for other cultures that were influenced by Confucianism, because this idea around like filial piety and your responsibilities to family built into those principles is so pervasive in many Asian cultures that it is very hard to dissect that. Like, I'm sure a big part of why our parents care for us and, like, are always concerned about if we are surviving and, like, you know, living our best lives from a more monetary and, like, other numerical standpoints is because they do care. However, it's also complicated because there is this implicit, like, you are my responsibility and you are my legacy, and what you do reflects on me. And also saving face is a big part of like the more successful you are, the more I can boast about you. Not to say like their main drive is to like, is their pride to be able to brag about us, but it is part of it in that also if you fail, it reflects poorly on them. So there's so many little tentacles at play around this idea of this major sacrifice and effort it takes to raise a child and to continue caring about the well-being and success of that child. There is love, but there are all these other things that just are baked into Asian parents that may not really be the case for other non-Asian parents because they don't have that foundational, like, societal principles stuck in how they see life.
Agree with you 100% there. Listeners, we hope you enjoyed following us on our search for parental love. We would love to hear from you what your own experience is, especially if you grew up in an Asian household or a household that has some kind of societal expectations or pressures on what a family structure should be. We would love to know what's an expression of love from your parents that you really value, whether or not that's verbal, act of service, something else. Let us know.
Yes, and come back next week for a fresh new episode. And until then, 再见, bitches.